On my birthday, Dad said, "We sold your car and cashed out your college fund. Your sister deserves a fresh start." Then slid over a loan agreement, co-signing her $22,000 debt or get out. I didn't argue. I just packed. By morning, they found the letter I left behind. Now my sister's panicking, Dad's driving around looking for me, and Mom's crying in the living room. I, 19M, thought my 18th birthday would finally mark my transition into adulthood. Instead, it became the day my family showed me exactly where I stood in their priorities. The morning started normally enough. Mom made pancakes, and my younger sister bounced around the kitchen talking about how our upcoming freshman year at the expensive private college Dad had somehow managed to secure for her despite her mediocre grades. I'd been looking forward to discussing my own college plans. I'd been accepted to the state university with a partial scholarship, and between my college fund and part-time job savings, everything seemed perfectly aligned. Dad waited until after breakfast to drop the bombshell. He asked me to sit down in the living room, and something in his expression made my stomach clench. Mom hovered nearby, wringing her hands, while my sister suddenly found her phone incredibly interesting. Dad explained that my sister had gotten herself into some financial trouble. Apparently, she'd been using credit cards to fund her lifestyle throughout senior year. Designer clothes, expensive dinners with friends, a spring break trip to Cancun that I'd assumed Dad had paid for. The debt had ballooned to $22,000, and the minimum payments were beyond what she could manage with her part-time retail job. Then came the second punch. Dad told me they'd sold my car, the reliable Honda Civic I'd been driving since I got my license, the one I'd assumed would come with me to college. The money from the sale, along with my entire college fund, had gone toward paying down my sister's credit card debt. I sat there processing this information, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. The college fund had been something my grandparents had started when I was born, contributions made every birthday and Christmas for 18 years. My car represented freedom and independence, my way to get to work and eventually to campus. Dad wasn't finished. He slid a thick stack of papers across the coffee table toward me. It was a loan agreement for the remaining balance of my sister's debt. He explained that I needed to co-sign, making me legally responsible for $22,000 of someone else's poor financial decisions. The alternative, he made clear, was to find somewhere else to live. My sister finally looked up from her phone to offer what she probably thought was a reasonable justification. She told me that college was more expensive than she'd anticipated, and she deserved to enjoy her senior year after working so hard in high school. She'd figured the family would help her out of this mess, and apparently, helping her out meant sacrificing my future. Mom added her voice to the conversation, suggesting that I could take a gap year, work full-time, and reapply to college later. She painted it as an opportunity for character building, a chance to mature before taking on the responsibilities of higher education. The irony of discussing maturity while asking me to clean up my sister's financial mess wasn't lost on me. I looked at the loan agreement, at the monthly payment schedule that would consume most of any entry-level salary I could hope to earn. I thought about my acceptance letter to the state university, about the partial scholarship I'd earned through 4 years of maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working 20 hours a week at the local grocery store. I thought about my carefully planned future dissolving because my sister couldn't resist buying another designer handbag. Dad pressed me for an answer, reminding me that I was legally an adult now and needed to start making adult decisions. The loan agreement sat on the table between us like a loaded weapon, and I realized that no matter what I chose, my relationship with my family would never be the same. I told them I needed some time to think about it. Dad gave me until the next morning to decide, making it clear that if I wasn't willing to co-sign, I'd need to make alternative living arrangements immediately. Mom suggested I could stay with my aunt across town, as if temporarily relocating would somehow make this betrayal more palatable. That evening, I went to my room and really considered my options. I could co-sign the loan, sacrifice my immediate college plans, and spend the next several years paying for my sister's mistakes while she enjoyed her debt-free college experience. Or I could refuse, effectively choosing homelessness over financial servitude to someone who'd never shown the slightest appreciation for the sacrifices others made on her behalf. I spent hours crafting a letter, pouring out 18 years of frustration and disappointment onto paper. I wrote about the birthday parties where my sister received elaborate gifts while I got practical presents. I detailed the family vacations cut short because of her dramatic episodes when she didn't get her way. I described the countless times I'd been asked to be the responsible one, to set a good example, to understand why her needs came before mine. Most importantly, I explained exactly what they'd taken from me. The college fund represented more than money. It was my grandparents' love and faith in my future, accumulated over nearly 2 decades of small but meaningful contributions. My car wasn't just transportation. It was independence, the ability to work and save and build towards something better. I told them that their decision had taught me everything I needed to know about my place in this family. I was the backup plan, the one who could be sacrificed when the golden child needed rescuing. I was expected to be mature and responsible while watching my sister face no consequences for her irresponsible choices. The letter concluded with my decision. I wouldn't be co-signing anything. I also wouldn't be staying in a house where my value was measured entirely by my usefulness in solving someone else's problems. I thank them for teaching me, through their actions, exactly what kind of family I didn't want to create for myself someday. I packed everything that truly mattered to me into 2 large duffel bags and my school backpack. 18 years of life condensed into what I could carry on foot. I left the letter on my pillow, along with my house key and the loan agreement they'd been so eager for me to sign. I left before dawn, walking the 6 miles to the bus station in the pre-morning darkness. I'd called my friend's older brother the night before. He'd graduated the previous year and was working construction while living in a small apartment across town. He'd agreed to let me crash on his couch until I could figure out a more permanent solution. The bus ride gave me time to think about what came next. I still had my job at the grocery store and I could pick up extra shifts now that I wasn't tied to anyone else's schedule. I could defer my college enrollment for a semester, maybe a full year, while I saved money and established independence. It wasn't the timeline I'd planned, but it was entirely mine. Update 1: By 8 in the morning, my phone started buzzing with calls and texts. Mom had discovered my letter and immediately called Dad home from his morning jog. My sister found out when she heard Mom crying in the living room, asking Dad how they'd let things get to this point. Mom's first call was predictably emotional. She asked me to come home so we could talk through this situation like a family. She promised they could work out some kind of compromise, maybe a smaller loan amount or a longer timeline for repayment. She couldn't seem to understand that the specific terms weren't the problem. It was the fundamental assumption that my future was theirs to bargain away. Dad's approach was more aggressive. He called twice, leaving voicemails that started with anger and shifted toward what I suppose he thought was reason. He reminded me that family members help each other, that I was being selfish and short-sighted. He suggested that cutting ties over money proved I'd never really understood what family meant in the first place. My sister's text messages were the most revealing. She started with accusations, calling me dramatic and selfish for abandoning the family over something that could be worked out. But as the day progressed, her tone shifted. She began asking where I was, whether I was safe, if I needed anything. The desperation in her messages suggested she was finally realizing that her financial mess might not have a simple solution without my cooperation. I didn't respond to any of them. I'd said everything I needed to say in the letter, and I wasn't interested in negotiations that started from the premise that I owed them my future. Update 2: 3 days after I left, the real consequences of their plan started becoming apparent. Dad had apparently assumed that threatening homelessness would force me to comply, that an 18-year-old wouldn't actually choose uncertainty over family obligation. He'd already made promises to my sister about handling her debt, commitments that now looked impossible to keep. Mom called my work, trying to get information about my whereabouts from my manager. She'd driven to the houses of friends she remembered from high school, asking if they'd seen me or knew where I was staying. The desperation in these actions suggested they were finally understanding that I hadn't just stormed off for dramatic effect. I'd actually left. My sister's situation grew more complicated when the credit card company started calling about missed payments. Dad had apparently told her the debt would be resolved quickly, so she'd stopped making even minimum payments. Now the interest was compounding, late fees were accumulating, and her credit score was taking additional damage with each passing day. Dad made increasingly frantic attempts to reach me, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry demands that I stop being childish to desperate pleas for me to at least let them know I was alive. He'd apparently spent hours driving around town, checking places he thought I might be staying, asking neighbors if they'd seen me. The grocery store manager mentioned that my family had been calling and stopping by, trying to get information about my schedule. I asked him not to share any details about my employment, explaining that I was dealing with a family situation and needed some space. He agreed, mentioning that my work ethic and reliability had always impressed him anyway. Update 3: A week after leaving, I received a call from my aunt, Mom's sister, who lived about 30 minutes away. She explained that Mom had contacted her, crying and asking if she'd heard from me. My aunt had always been the practical one in the family, the one who asked uncomfortable questions when everyone else preferred comfortable lies. She told me that Mom had explained the situation from their perspective, painting my departure as an overreaction to a reasonable request for family support. But my aunt had pressed for details, asking specific questions about the timeline, the amounts involved, and the alternatives they'd considered. The more she learned, the more skeptical she became of their version of events. My aunt asked if I wanted to meet for coffee to talk through the situation. She promised she wasn't trying to mediate or convince me to return home. She just wanted to understand what had really happened and whether there was anything she could do to help. We met at a diner halfway between her house and where I was staying. I showed her the loan agreement Dad had presented, explained about my college fund and car being sold without my knowledge or consent, and detailed the ultimatum I'd been given. She listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking her head or muttering under her breath. When I finished, she told me something that provided crucial context for my family's financial desperation. Apparently, Dad had been struggling with work for months, taking pay cuts, and losing contracts in his consulting business. The financial pressure had been building long before my sister's debt crisis emerged, which explained why liquidating my assets had seemed like their only option. My aunt offered practical support without strings attached. She could help me open a bank account in my name only, co-sign an apartment lease if needed, or provide references for better employment opportunities. Most importantly, she validated my decision to leave rather than accept responsibility for someone else's financial mistakes. She also shared her perspective on my sister's behavior patterns, observations she'd made during family gatherings over the years. The credit card debt wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was part of a broader pattern of expecting others to handle the consequences of her choices. My aunt had watched my parents enable this behavior for years, always finding ways to rescue my sister from situations that should have taught her important lessons about responsibility. Update 4. 2 weeks after my departure, the situation at home had deteriorated significantly. My aunt served as an informal information source, staying in touch with Mom while also keeping me updated on developments. My sister's debt crisis had worsened substantially. Without my co-signature on a consolidation loan, she was stuck making minimum payments on multiple high-interest credit cards while late fees and penalties continued accumulating. The total debt had grown from $22,000 to nearly $25,000, and her minimum monthly payments were increasing accordingly. Dad's consulting business was struggling more than I'd realized. He'd apparently been using credit himself to cover business expenses and household costs, hoping that things would improve before the bills came due. My sister's debt emergency had forced him to examine the family's overall financial situation, revealing a much more precarious position than anyone had understood. Mom's emotional state had become increasingly fragile as she realized the full scope of their problems. She'd apparently spent days calling relatives, trying to find someone willing to loan money or co-sign agreements to help resolve my sister's debt. The responses had been uniformly negative, with various family members expressing surprise that my college fund had been liquidated to address someone else's spending problems. My sister had finally started facing real consequences for her financial decisions. Her part-time retail job couldn't cover both her credit card minimums and basic living expenses, forcing her to cut back dramatically on the lifestyle that had created the debt in the first place. She'd moved back into her childhood bedroom full-time and was taking the bus to work since Dad couldn't afford to maintain insurance on multiple vehicles. The most significant development was my sister's growing panic about her college enrollment. The private school she'd planned to attend required proof of financial stability before allowing students to register for classes. With her credit score damaged and no co-signer available for additional loans, her acceptance was in jeopardy. Dad had apparently made desperate attempts to contact the college's financial aid office, trying to explain the situation and request extensions or alternative arrangements. But private colleges rarely show flexibility for families who can't demonstrate adequate financial resources, especially when the problems stem from discretionary spending rather than unexpected emergencies. My absence had created a practical problem they hadn't anticipated. I'd been handling various household responsibilities while working and attending school, grocery shopping, minor repairs, lawn maintenance, and general organization. Without my contributions, these tasks had fallen to other family members who were already struggling with their own responsibilities and the stress of their financial situation. The final outcome arrived exactly 1 month after my birthday. My sister's college enrollment was canceled due to insufficient financial documentation, and she was placed on a waiting list for the following year pending resolution of her credit issues. Dad's business officially declared bankruptcy, forcing him to close his consulting practice and seek traditional employment for the first time in 15 years. Mom had what my aunt described as a complete emotional breakdown, requiring a brief hospitalization for stress and anxiety. The combination of losing her son, watching her daughter's college dreams evaporate, and seeing her husband's business fail had proved too much for her to handle simultaneously. I felt a complicated mix of emotions learning about their struggles. I wasn't happy about their pain, but I also wasn't surprised by the consequences of their choices. They'd created an unsustainable situation based on unrealistic assumptions about other people's willingness to sacrifice for my sister's mistakes. My own situation had stabilized considerably. I'd moved into a small studio apartment, picked up additional shifts at work, and begun planning for college enrollment the following semester. It wasn't the timeline I'd originally envisioned, but it was built on a foundation I could trust, my own effort and decision-making rather than dependence on people who'd proved willing to sacrifice my future for their convenience. The grocery store manager had offered me a promotion to assistant supervisor, recognizing the reliability and maturity I'd demonstrated during a difficult period. The additional income would help me save faster for college, while also building work experience that would serve me well regardless of my eventual career path. I never responded to their calls, texts, or attempts to contact me through mutual acquaintances. The letter I'd left said everything that needed to be said, and subsequent events had only confirmed the accuracy of my assessment. They'd viewed me as a solution to someone else's problems rather than a person with my own dreams and deserving of support. 6 months later, I received word through my aunt that my sister had enrolled in community college and was working full-time to pay down her debt. Dad had found employment as a project manager with a large corporation, earning less than his consulting practice had generated, but providing stable income and benefits. Mom was receiving counseling and had started working part-time as a substitute teacher. They were rebuilding their lives around the reality that I wouldn't be returning to solve their problems or pretend that their treatment of me had been acceptable. It was the first time in years that my sister was facing genuine consequences for her choices, and according to my aunt, she was finally showing signs of developing actual financial responsibility. I started college that fall, using a combination of loans in my name, scholarship money, and savings from my job. It wasn't the debt-free experience my original college fund would have provided, but it was entirely my own achievement. Every dollar I borrowed and every payment I made represented my own choices rather than obligations imposed by other people's mistakes. The story ends not with reconciliation or forgiveness, but with the recognition that sometimes walking away is the only way to preserve your self-respect and future. My family had shown me exactly who they were when they thought they could control my choices through financial manipulation and emotional pressure. I believed them, and I built my life accordingly.